There we go. You can hear that that is a very different sort of melody than you would get in Beethoven, and it's certainly a different sort of melody that, you know, if Beethoven were alive 30 years later and were to listen to that, he would wonder how a horn could possibly get all of those notes without changing the tone quality. But by the time you get to Mendelssohn, you get composers who are writing for this valved horn. And then I say by the time you get to the later 19th century, Tchaikovsky wrote quite a bit for the horn, and it was just automatically assumed that that horn players would be playing out a valved horn, and that by the time you get to late 19th century, that was the assumption, and it was always sort of German and Russian composers like Tchaikovsky would always look at French composers and say, why are you still writing for natural horn? And it just became sort of assumed who one that one would write for a valved horn. Anyway, going along with that, and as I say, that the valved horn had all these unintended consequences, but the symphonists, or the composers generally of the late 19th century, used horns more and more with the brasses and sometimes with the woodwinds, but it was traditionally considered more of a woodwindy instrument because it was the sort of first brass instrument to be introduced into the orchestra. And then by the time you get to the late 19th century, it is actually quite nice for us horn players because we get to play both with the woodwinds and the brass. It's only in the 20th century that it became entirely sort of regarded as a very brass-oriented instrument. And so 20th century composers wrote for horns, trumpets, trombones, and wrote a little less for horns with the woodwinds in the context of a symphony orchestra. But in the 19th century, it was regarded as both ways. And if you hear a Brahms symphony, and you'll notice there are 4 horns in all the Brahms symphonies, and what Brahms did, comparable to French composers, he sort of assumed, Brahms was considered a conservative composer in that he assumed that people would be playing on the natural horn, although he tolerated valved horns in a way that many French authorities did not. If you ever hear a Brahms symphony, you will hear consistently that the first and second horns, or 2 of the horns, play with the woodwinds and strings a lot, and then the other 2 horns will play a lot with the brass, will play a lot with the trombones and the trumpets a lot. And so composers sort of found a way that the horn could sort of bridge the gap or go back and forth between these two different orchestra groups. And so the horn became this sort of bridge instrument. And eventually you get, or not even eventually, it goes back before that, but that's one of the reasons why the horn today plays both in a brass quintet and a woodwind quintet, that in the 19th century, it started to be used in both ways. So you've got these big orchestra halls that really call for some large brass, and the horns are part of that. But you also have symphonists wanting to compose in an older tradition, and the horn would be used with the woodwinds as well. So we hear that in the 19th century. If we have time, I'll come back and play a little bit more of these later romantics and how they use the horn as a melodic instrument. But just in the interest of time, I will go on a little bit. Does anybody have any questions before we go on? I've lost the chat momentarily, but hopefully I can get it back. So I can't quite tell if anybody has questions, but but feel free to unmute if you have any questions as we go along. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go on. So a little bit about German opera, because it's in German opera that that you really see horns become a very prominent part of the orchestra. And I already played an excerpt from Carl Maria von Weber's Der Freischütz. That's often considered the sort of one of the early uniquely German operas. There were, Mozart wrote some before that, Beethoven had written some before that. But in Der Freischütz, the horns are used quite prominently. These are mostly natural horns, but they are, as I say, a symbol of outdoors and nature and the like. But one of the things you see in German opera composing of the 19th century is you see an increased size of orchestra. So if you compare the orchestra of say, Beethoven, Beethoven's Fidelio, which is written at the beginning of the 19th century, and you compare the size of the orchestra there to the size of the orchestra of, say, Richard Strauss's Salome or Electra or the like, which is written about 100 years later. You see that the size of the Strauss orchestra is about twice the size of a Beethoven orchestra. And it requires much larger, both strings, there a lot more strings, but also a lot more instruments. So instead of having 2 horns, you suddenly have 8 horns. And instead of having a sort of small, a smaller orchestra, you suddenly have harps, and big opera halls were required to house these, and big opera halls with big pits. And the largest representation of this would be Richard Wagner made an opera hall, or helped construct an opera hall at Bayreuth that has an enormous orchestra pit that can encompass and include the size of orchestra that Wagner had in mind. So the transition from a Weber, or before Weber a Beethoven, to a Wagner, and after Wagner a Strauss in late 19th century German opera, is one where the size of the orchestra increased, the technological changes of the instruments allowed for a lot more sound, and the role of brass generally, and particularly horns, increased. So suddenly, if you, horn players who play Wagner operas, it's quite common to only play half of an opera each night. And then, so in the Metropolitan Opera, for instance, if they play Die Messinger, which is a Wagner opera that written near the end of the 19th century, that goes on for 5 hours, they will often change out the horn players and even some woodwind players after the first 2 or 3 acts, because there's so much demanded of these players. And so it's so people had to sort of react to how these composers were, the demands these composers were making. So I say that the size of the orchestra and the volume generated, and then the role of the opera as well. And this is one of the things that Wagner's often credited for, but other composers of his time, like Verdi, also deserve some help, is that the orchestra ceases to be just a sort of accompaniment to the singers, but takes on a role of its own. So the orchestra will hint at plot changes or at emotional changes, even if there aren't any singers on stage, or even unbeknownst to the characters that the singers are acting out. And so the orchestra takes on an increased role, which allows for composers to add certain colors or to use the instruments more freely, and and so that you get the horn playing a prominent role in say Wagner's operas, much more Wagner than many of the other composers of the era, although Verdi wrote quite nicely for horn, but in Wagner the horn plays a very important role, and I'm going to give you an example here. This is from the opera Siegfried, and then in Wagner's Ring Cycle, this is another opera that takes an enormously long time, about 4 hours, and the whole cycle of 4 operas takes about 16 hours. But in this, the Siegfried, who is sort of he's a hero, but he's not always the brightest bulb either. He's sort of a hero who Wagner sometimes mocks as well. But Siegfried has this call that, and we'll see that. And Wagner uses a solo horn who is actually off stage. He's not in the pit. If I were to play this horn, I would go off stage in order to play this part. But you'll see the actor on stage who is pretending to blow a horn while the horn player is off stage and actually playing the part. And Siegfried is making this call, again, a symbol of outdoors, of hunting, because Siegfried is sort of off on a hunt, and he's about to encounter the dragon. And at the very end of this scene, which you can see, you will see a dragon starting to come out of the from the back of the stage. So we'll take a listen to Wagner's opera Siegfried and the use of the horn in that opera. So let's try this. New share. Go. Sorry, it's taking a little bit to load up here. There we go. Oh, let's start that over again. Here we go. It's a really neat moment there. Horn. Oops, sorry. Oh, there we go. Horn players love to play that excerpt because it's so much fun to play. And Wagner uses the horn that way as a sort of as a call. It goes back to old horn hunting calls like. But it's used in a much more late 19th century romantic context there. And then I already mentioned Richard Strauss and his large orchestra and the like. We'll hear a little bit more of Strauss in a moment or later on. And by the time you get to when Strauss writes to Rosenkavalier, which is into the 20th century, he's bridged that gap there. But you will hear that he is influenced by composers like Wagner and Weber before him. And uses the horn all over the place, that nobody demands more of horn players than Richard Strauss. But we love to play him. He's a wonderful composer. So in any case, oops, everybody can see me okay? Everybody can, yeah, and you can see the slides? Like, okay, good. Again, I for some reason, I click on the chat and it's not showing up for me. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and unmute yourself and feel free to interrupt me because I'm for some reason I'm not getting the chat right now. So anyway, go ahead and do that whenever you'd like. I mentioned last time a little bit about in each of these three weeks, I'll talk about one sort of virtuoso horn player of the era. And last week, if you remember, or if you were here last week, I talked about Jan Václav Stík, who also went by Giovanni Punto, and he was a sort of master of hand horn technique, and Beethoven wrote for him, and he performed with Beethoven, and he performed the works of Haydn and Mozart and his own compositions. 1 century later, living almost exactly 1 century later, was a fellow by the name of Franz Strauss. I had just mentioned in the last slide that Richard Strauss is often taken as a sort of bridge between 19th century German opera and 20th century composition. Franz Strauss is Richard Strauss's father. And Franz Strauss was a horn player. He was a virtuoso hornist and principal horn in the Bavarian court opera. And he also was the horn player sort of in demand when Wagner wrote that, so say Siegfried's Horn Call, that would have been first performed by Franz Strauss. Richard Wagner supposedly absolutely adored his horn playing, but the two of them never got along. If you've ever heard anything about Richard Wagner and his history, you might understand why people would not get along with him very well. He was a very difficult personality, not always an admirable one, in spite of his great musical compositions. In any case, Franz Strauss had an animosity towards Wagner, and it was returned. Wagner never liked Strauss, but always wanted him as his horn player. So he wrote all of Wagner's compositions, including that horn call that we just listened to, would have been written for Franz Strauss. Franz Strauss was also a composer. I think he was a very good composer. His works are continue to be performed by hornists. He mostly wrote for horn. He wrote etudes. He wrote some duets. He wrote and then he wrote some concert pieces, which horn players still play today. He might not have quite the sort of ingenuity and originality of his son Richard Strauss, but he was a very accomplished composer as well as a virtuoso horn player. So I'm going to play a little bit of one of Franz Strauss's pieces. It's called Nocturno, which just means night, a night song, and it's a lovely piece that is still performed today. But you'll hear a little bit of sort of 19th century horn playing. This would be the or 19th century horn composition written by a hornist himself. And so you'll see it's very well suited to the horn. So I'll take a little listen to that.
Greg, while that's loading, if you hover at the bottom of your screen, click on your chat bubble, and that should bring up a side screen with it'll be white. Do you see that now?
Nope. The problem is that I've lost that bubble.
Okay, if you go up to the upper right hand side of your screen, maybe press speaker view. It's a view issue. I'm watching the chat, so if anybody else on the call has questions, just send it to everyone. And if you're not seeing it, Greg, I'll intervene. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, this is Franz Strauss's Nocturno. Yep. but isn't that a lovely melody? I always enjoy listening to that. I mentioned last week that originally I was planning to play have a little short concert associated with each of these classes. We can't really do that being online, but next summer I will play a recital. I'll try to include this piece because this piece is always a favorite of that. It's just a lovely melody that's really well suited to the horn, and you can see that the composer knew what he was doing when he wrote for horn, because he was a hornist himself. So it's that was Franz Strauss's Nocturno, and a little introduction to another virtuoso horn player, this time of the 19th century. Yeah. I'm sorry, I keep looking for the chat box and it's not there. So again, feel free to interrupt if you have any questions as you go along. In any case, if I don't hear from you, I'm just going to keep going. So little note about I have up here on the screen. I hope everybody can see. It says the Wagner Tuba. Everybody can see that? Yep. Okay. So so if you play a clarinet, and if you ever look at an orchestra, and you might see, I'm just using clarinet as an example, but clarinetists are required to play several different kinds of instruments. They have a B flat clarinet, which is what most of us are familiar with, an A clarinet, which is a slightly larger clarinet, changes, an E flat clarinet, which is small, and then they have a bass clarinet and a contrabass clarinet, and there are a lot of different clarinets that clarinetists have to learn, a lot of different instruments. And the same is true for other instruments too. There are a lot of different saxophones. There are a lot of different trumpets. Even tuba players have to learn tubas that are keyed into different and on different pitches. For the most part, horn players only have the one instrument that we play. This is the only instrument I own. But in the 19th century, this was a time when people were inventing new instruments right and left. And so, for instance, the 19th century is when Adolf Sax developed saxophones, and he was actually influential in developing the instrument you see before you, which is the Wagner Tuba. It's called the Wagner Tuba because it was a request of Richard Wagner to, he wanted certain kinds of instruments for his operas that were like a horn and could be played by the horn players, but had a more direct sound for projection. So if you see a horn player, and I'm going to point my camera down a little bit in order so you can see, when I hold the horn, my bell is pointing backwards, which creates a quite nice reflected sound. But Wagner wanted an instrument that would be pointing forwards in his opera house and would really project out of the orchestra pit, and that had a slightly different sound than a horn. Somehow, horns weren't quite the sound that he wanted. Trombones weren't quite the sound he wanted. Tubas weren't quite the sound he wanted. He wanted something that was like a horn but slightly different. And so he asked Adolf Sax and some other instrument makers what they could come up with. And what they came up with was this thing called a Wagner Tuba. And if you look at the picture, you'll see that it kind of looks like a tuba. It's a little less conical than a tuba, than most standard tubas, but it's much more conical than say a trombone or anything else. So it's more like a horn as far as how the increase of the sound chamber, or the air chamber that the air goes through in the horn. And you use a horn mouthpiece for it, so a horn player would play it. But it's used in the ring cycle, in the operas that the Siegfried's horn call came from, and Wagner used this instrument every so often to give a little bit of tone color change and the like. Well, it was his use of the Wagner tuba inspired a number of other composers as well. Some of them were paying tribute to Wagner, and then in doing so, and then some others just liked the sound. So I've given three sort of well-known composers who used the Wagner tuba. It is a very sort of strange, almost otherworldly sound that comes out of the Wagner tuba. But Bruckner used the Wagner tuba in his last three symphonies, in the 7th, 8th, and 9th symphonies. And Strauss used the Wagner tuba a little bit. And then Stravinsky, if you ever hear Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, he has a section in the middle of the Rite of Spring, which is a sort of wild sound, and you hear these Wagner tubas sounding out through in the Rite of Spring as well. And so you continue to get some composers who write for the Wagner tuba, but it never really caught on the way some of the other instruments did. So it's used in tends to be used in a very selective group of instruments. But every so often, if you go to the orchestra, particularly if you hear Wagner, Bruckner, Strauss, or Stravinsky, you will see the horn players pick up this other instrument. I should just mention, I've played this instrument a number of times. It is one of the hardest instruments to get in tune that I've ever played before. And so it's an enormous challenge, but at the same time, it is it's loads of fun. It's just a lot of fun to play. And the fact that you don't get to play it very often only adds to it. So because I'll give you an excerpt very soon of how it was used by Bruckner in his, I believe, 7th symphony. But this is some people sometimes ask, particularly if they see, clarinetists or flutes. There are a number of different flutes, or the oboe plays the English horn sometimes, or trumpets carry around a bag with many different trumpets in them, including a piccolo trumpet or an alto trumpet alike. Well, we horn players do sometimes have to play a second instrument, but not very often. Usually we just have to carry around one instrument. So in any case, so tying in with that is that the Austrian Symphonists, and I'm mostly thinking of Bruckner and Mahler, but there were some other composers as well, who really used the horn and then would use the Wagner tuba as well in sort of near the end of the 19th century. And you really sort of, if you, oh, sorry, I mentioned last week that I might have a kid who comes in because I have some kids who are here. Sam, what? You want to come upstairs for a moment? Yeah. Okay. So, can I have a snack? Yes, you can. Can you ask Isaac to get it for you? Okay. Okay. Anyway, I have a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, and an 8-year-old at home, and the 3-year-old just wanted a snack, so his older brother will get it for him right now. Sorry for the interruption, but that's one of the things you get when you have all of these virtual classrooms, I suppose. In any case, where was I? Oh yeah, later Austrian symphonists, which would include Anton Bruckner and Gustav Mahler. These are composers primarily composing at the end of the 19th century. And I mentioned before that, composers like Wagner and Strauss and many of the German composers of the 19th century really put a lot of both demands upon their horn players and also use their horn sections as prominent instruments in the orchestra. So if you compare the, say, late 18th century to late 19th century, you will see that horn players play a lot more. There are a lot more horns. So Mozart wrote mostly for 2 horns. Mozart and Haydn wrote mostly for 2 horns. Beethoven also wrote mostly for 2 horns, although he has a couple symphonies that use more. And then Brahms and Tchaikovsky would write for 4 horns. And well, by the time you get to Bruckner and Mahler, who are Austrian symphonists, 4 horns just wouldn't do it anymore. So so I think Mahler has one of his symphonies uses 4 horns, and all of his other symphonies use at least 7, usually 8, sometimes even more than that. Bruckner begins writing for 4 horns, which was sort of standard, but by the time he's finished, he's writing for 8 horns and 4 Wagner tubas as well. And so you sort of reach peak orchestra size at the end of the 19th century with these Austrian symphonists. So if you go to a symphony today and you hear a work by Bruckner or Mahler or maybe Richard Strauss, this is the end of the 19th century, you will see not only that the size of the orchestra is the largest that you will see, but probably there's probably some 20th century composers who wrote for more, but it becomes more rare. But also that there are more horns, both offstage and onstage. So next year, at least the plan is, the West Michigan Symphony is going to play Mahler's Symphony No. 2. That's up in Muskegon. And we were going to play it this last spring, but instead we obviously it was canceled. But Mahler Symphony No. 2 calls for 8 horns on stage, and then at least 5 more off stage. So you get a sense of just how many horn players were needed at this time, and how much these Austrian symphonists weaved the horn and the importance of the horn into their compositions. So one of the things that made them do that is that they were very influenced, especially Bruckner was very influenced by Beethoven's melodic construction. So Bruckner's melodies tend to be these arpeggios that actually will fit on a natural horn, although Bruckner didn't intend them for the natural horn. They're a very organ-like sound, which fits very well with the winds and brass. Huge orchestra, and then, as I say, Bruckner in his last 3 symphonies made use of Wagner tubas. So I'm going to play a little clip here that lets you hear a little bit of how Wagner tubas would have been used. This is from the second movement of his 7th symphony. And I may need to find it. It's at 26 minutes, but so give me a moment to find it. But you'll hear how the Wagner tubas were used by Bruckner. Oh, I just got the chat back. So so if you have questions, feel free to use chat again. Thank you. Yes. Okay, let me call up this video and we can listen to a little bit of Bruckner's 7th Symphony. We just heard the end of the first movement. Now they're about to start on the second movement, which begins with Wagner tubas. So you can hear that. That is the Wagner tubas are playing the melody over a bed of strings, and in this recording you can really hear the strings prominently, but hopefully you could hear a little bit of the Wagner tubas as well. That it's just this sort of big, open, billowy sound that sounds almost as otherworldly. Okay, so let me move back here. There we go. Oops, now I've lost the chat again. And, oh, there it is. Now I got it again. Okay. There we go. Can everybody see my screen? Was the PowerPoint up again with the Austrian Symphonists? Everybody can see that? Okay, great.
I can see it.
Yep. Okay, good. Good. In any case, I had one other video clip to show you that I wanted to make sure that we had time for it, but that brings us to the end of the 19th century. The French are still playing on natural horns mostly. The German, Austrian, Russian composers, most other European countries have all moved to valve horns and even onto things like Wagner tubas, right? The horns are a very prominent part of the orchestra. What we'll see in next week is some reaction against this. And so the early 20th century, many of the early 20th century composers and horn players for that matter said enough of this just making orchestras and horns and everything bigger and bigger and louder. Let's get some colors back in. And so what we'll cover next week is those changes in there. But I wanted to go back and probably the one clip that we didn't get to because I was afraid of time, but I mentioned that later Romantic composers like Tchaikovsky, so if you think of a Romantic composer, perhaps Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Dvorak, these are sort of classical, these are normally assumed to be stereotypically Romantic composers. And when Tchaikovsky wrote for horn, it was definitely not for natural horn. So the clip I'll show you of a famous Tchaikovsky horn solo is you could never play this on I mean, you could play it on a natural horn, but it would sound very strange. And you'll see that the horn is given a prominent part in the orchestra, is given a very melodic line that sort of uses all of the available notes, all of the notes you could get on a piano, and many of them are used within this solo because you can change keys, you can be chromatic about it, and the like. This is from Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony, and then after we listen to this, a little of this, we can. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about the 19th century music or about horns in the 19th century. But let's take a listen. This is share. There we go. I think my computer is a little bit slow today, so just bear with it. I'd like to keep listening to the whole symphony, but we don't have time right now. But that's one of the more famous horn solos. We've gotten to hear a number of the between the Mendelssohn Nocturne and the Wagner Siegfried Call and the like. Many of the most famous horn solos that we're familiar with today are from this late 19th century period when you could write for a valved horn, but you still had a little bit of that romantic spirit going. So in any case, we still have a little bit of time, and I'm wondering if anybody has any questions about the 19th century or about horn playing or anything else like that. I've been talking a lot today, so.
Greg, where were most of the horns made during the 19th century? Was it primarily Germany and Austria, and were they almost handcrafted, or were there actually like manufacturing facilities that made them?
Thanks. Yeah. In the 19th century, they would have all been handcrafted. The Industrial Revolution didn't catch up to horn playing until the 20th century, and even there, even today, most horns are still handcrafted. There are factory horns, and some of them are quite good, and some of them aren't. But most horn players today who are playing professionally play with a handcrafted horn. So that tradition still lives on. They were made all over Europe, and you first see the American instrument makers making horns as well in the 19th century. Maybe they made them in the 18th century. I don't know of them being made in the 18th century, but probably there were a few, but there weren't any sort of big American manufacturers or makers back then. The type of horn and the style, the way that the metal is wrapped around on a horn these days, this comes from the 19th century. The way that the horn is, that the metal is wrapped around in this pattern. And there are a couple of different patterns that developed in the 19th century that became more prominent throughout the 20th century. They were associated with a fellow by the name of Carl Geyer, who worked mostly actually in France, but I'm not sure. I think he was of German ancestry. And then another one of Edward Crispy, who and our modern horns today have developed out of those instrument makers of the 19th century. So the horns that you see today are, and there are a few others as well, like Schmidt and Paxman and the like, who Paxman was out of Great Britain, Schmidt was out of Germany, but the horns that you see today were really first developed, that sort of style of wrapping the horn and of developing the horn were really developed in the 19th century. And you would have instrument makers obviously before that. It's just that when valves came in, suddenly you wouldn't make a valved horn as a hobby for the most part. And probably a few did, but it takes a lot more technological know-how in order to make a valved horn. Because you can be an amateur and a hobbyist and make a good natural horn. It's not easy. I've never done it, but if you know your way around metalworking and know how to know the basics of horn playing, you can probably make a natural horn that's pretty good. But making a valved horn is much more difficult, and you have to just tuning the instrument to make all the valves work is very difficult. And so you needed some sort of fine, craft people in order to do that in a way. And then eventually, by the 20th century, you get makers who can, you get factories making horns, which are, most student model horns are factory horns these days. And some professional model horns are as well, but some professionals still, are still handcrafted. Yeah.
Greg?
Yeah. Thanks.
Greg, can you hear me? I don't know if you can or not. Okay.
Yes, I can.
I have a more basic question. My husband was a high school band teacher, and he's not here, or I'd ask him this. But we have a grandson playing trumpet who is enthralled with music, and he is going to become a band teacher himself when he goes to college. So my basic question is, knowing that my husband knows his way around all the instruments basically, will a trumpet player find it easy to find his way around the French horn, which seems to me much more complicated than trumpet?
The answer is yes, and it's common in a lot of schools, not all schools. I started, I played a little piano before the horn, but then I started right on horn. But it's fairly common to move trumpet players to horns. My experience with band directors, and if they ever ask me, which isn't often, but it's occasionally, is that if somebody has played an instrument before, it doesn't need to be trumpet or it doesn't need to be a brass instrument. Even it can be something like a flute or any number of other things. They may find it a little easier as a result to pick up the horn the first time. And part of that is due to the instruments that are commonly used in bands today. That it's sometimes said that a horn is a more difficult instrument than other instruments. I don't really believe that's true, but there's a hint of truth to it, only in this, and that is that horns are expected to play notes in a middle school or elementary school or even a high school band, where it's very easy to miss the note because you can get, with the same valve combination, the same fingers being pushed down, you can get a number of different notes. So with no valves down, for instance, I can get 5 different notes within one octave, in the octave that is expected of beginning horn players. And in contrast, if you play the trumpet, with the same valve combination, you can only get 3 notes. If I had a trumpet up here, I would show you that there are only 3 notes available on trumpet, and so it's a lot easier to get the right notes on a trumpet when you're just beginning. That's partly because most most schools that give a kid a horn for the first time will give him or her a single F horn, for which, as I say, there are 5 notes in the octave that they could get with the same valve combination. So you say, well, push down second finger. Well, that's not a guarantee that they'll get the right note. And so because of that it became sort of standard to say that a horn is a difficult instrument to learn. If they used a smaller horn, if it was standard not to have these huge, big single F horns, but instead to have high B flat or high F horns, which are made. But if they just changed the instrument, you could play a horn, just like I have here, and it wouldn't be any harder than a trumpet.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know how band teachers can do this without knowing intimately every instrument, but apparently they do. Kids learn from somebody standing in front of them with or without a demonstration instrument. So I'm in awe.
Yes. I absolutely. I have found that it's often useful on when somebody is beginning the horn. What I always tell band directors, if they ever ask for my advice, is get somebody on the horn who has a good ear, who hears pitches, and will know when they're on the right pitch and when they're on the wrong pitch, and it becomes a lot easier. They don't have to have any sort of other special skill other than that they can recognize pitches. And as I say, so that's why it helps sometimes to have learned a previous instrument, even if it's, flute or guitar or whatever, just because it makes it a little easier to hear the pitches. And once they do that, then it actually becomes a lot more fun for them to play the horn, because they suddenly are like, well, I can play just as many melodies. I can do just as much on the horn as anybody can do on any other instrument, for that matter. I don't just have to play like the same 3 notes over and over again because I can hear what pitch I'm supposed to be on. So I think it generally is true that beginning horn players do struggle often, partly because of the instrument that they're often given, and partly because if they don't already hear pitches well, it can be a tricky instrument to start out on. Yeah. But,
Okay, thanks. I also know person would say it's the heaviest one to put on a school bus, and a lot of people will choose to pick up the flute instead.
Yes, that's true. Yes, it is. Yes, a piccolo is always recommended for transportation. Yes, yes.
I find that the horn adds so much depth and fullness to an orchestra piece.
I like it as well. Yeah, I can enjoy orchestra pieces when the horns aren't playing. So I don't want to knock the other instruments or anything like that. But
No, but I think it adds to it.
yes,
That's all.
yes. Does anybody have any other questions or anything? Oops, I'm getting a little bit of chat here. So, oh yes, just asking if I'm getting the chat message, and I am. Yep. Well, great. Well, we've hit 10:58, and so it's 11 o'clock, and I'm looking forward to talking about the 20th century and bringing us up to today next week. But thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to next week.
Thank you.
Greg. That was great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. What a wonderful class.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. See you
Bye.
next week. Greg, do you have anything you want to talk about before we end, or should I go ahead and end the meeting?
You can go ahead and